22 steps. That is the number you will count in your sleep for the rest of your life, though you don't know that yet. 22 steps between the Princess Victoria's bedroom on the upper floor of Kensington Palace and the hall below, and you are never, under any circumstance, for any reason, to let her walk them without your hand in hers or the Baroness's. Not because she might fall. She's 13 years old and sturdier on her feet than half the footmen who serve her. It's because a girl who is never alone cannot be reached by anyone her mother has not already approved. That's the whole of it. That's the system, though nobody in this palace calls it that to your face. You just call it the rules, and you learn them your first week the way you learn where the floorboards creak, because getting them wrong costs you more than a scolding. You're 16 years old, and your name is Alice Prentice, and you have been an under-housemaid in the princess's household at Kensington Palace for 4 months when this story really begins, though the truth is it began long before you arrived, and will not finish for years after you leave. You were hired because your aunt does mending for the Duchess of Kent's wardrobe woman, and put in a word, and because you can read and write a little, which matters more here than you'd think, and because you are quiet. Quiet is the single most valuable quality a servant can possess in this household. Louder girls don't last. Picture a palace that isn't really a palace anymore, not in the way you'd imagine one. Kensington has 40 rooms nobody uses, and 6 that are used constantly, and the difference between them is damp. Walk through the empty state apartments on the west side and your breath fogs in November same as December. Plaster crumbling in grey flakes off the ceiling roses. Brocade curtains gone the colour of dishwater, and somewhere behind the wainscoting, always, the scratch and scurry of rats large enough that the between maids won't go in alone after dark. Then walk 50 feet to the rooms where the Duchess of Kent and her daughter actually live, and it's warm, and the fires are kept lit from 6 in the morning until midnight, and every surface gleams, because girls like you spend 4 hours a day making it gleam, and none of the warmth reaches the empty half of the building at all. That's Kensington in 1836. A grand address with damp in its bones and a fire burning in only one wing of it, and everyone inside pretending the whole house is as bright as the part they're standing in. We're going back there tonight. Not to the parts you've read about in the history books, the coronation and the crown and the long widowed decades after. We're going back to before any of that, when she was still just a girl in a house that controlled her more completely than any prison controls its prisoners, because a prison at least tells you plainly that you're a prisoner. This house told her it loved her. Your hands are cracked at the knuckles from the lye soap before this story's a week old. Get comfortable. Here we go. The bell in your attic room rings at 5:30, which means you're dressed and downstairs with the fires laid before 6, which means the room where the princess sleeps is the second one you tend to, after the breakfast room, because the housekeeper, Mrs. Louis, has a rule that the fire nearest the princess must never be laid while she's still sleeping in the bed 6 feet from it. You kneel on the cold hearthstone in the grey half-light, and even in June you can feel the stone's chill soak up through your knees and into your bones. A deep ache that settles in and doesn't leave until you've been moving for an hour. You lay the kindling the way you were taught, cross-hatched, 3 sticks over 2, and you strike the flint with hands that are already reddened and stiff from the water you hauled at 5, and you blow gently, gently, until the first curl of smoke turns into the first small orange tongue. And only then do you allow yourself to add the coal, because coal smothers flame if you're impatient with it, and impatience in this house gets you sent home without a character. The room itself you have come to know better than almost any other space in the world, better than your own mother's kitchen, because you clean it every single day, and because the two people who sleep in it never leave you any privacy in which to do the work quickly. That's the detail that took you longest to understand when you first arrived. The Princess Victoria does not have her own bedroom. She shares it every night with her mother, the Duchess, in a single chamber with two beds pushed close enough together that a woman lying in either one can reach across and touch the other. She has shared this room since before she could walk, and she will go on sharing it. You are told by the older housemaids with a kind of grim satisfaction at knowing something you don't yet, until either she marries or something happens that nobody in this house says aloud. You dust the small writing table by the window, and every morning there's a fresh page in the exercise book the Baroness leaves for her, dense with the girl's careful slanting hand, French verbs or a passage copied from Hume's history, or some mornings a private diary entry that you're absolutely forbidden to read and that you do not read, though you cannot help but see, in the seconds it takes to move the book to dust beneath it, a line or two swim up at you. Once, early on, you saw the words, "I wish I might go out." That's all. 4 words, and then a careful line drawn beneath them as if she'd decided that was quite enough complaining for one entry. You put the book down exactly where it had been, aligned with the edge of the blotter, because Baroness Letson reads every page of that diary every single night before bed, and everyone in the household knows it, including, you would learn later, the girl who writes it. The lessons themselves run from 9 until past 4 most days, with only a short break for a plain dinner at 1, and you have come to know their rhythm the way you know the rhythm of the fires, because tending the schoolroom hearth means moving quietly in and out of a room where a girl not much older than you spends more waking hours than she spends anywhere else in the palace. French conjugations before breakfast, history and geography through the long middle stretch of the morning, arithmetic that she frowns over with a concentration that makes her look, for those minutes, older than her years, drawing and music in the afternoon when her tutors judge her attention, finally flagging enough to need the change. You have watched over the 4 months the particular way she holds a pen too tightly when she's nervous about being corrected, and the particular small huff of breath she allows herself, never louder than that, when a sum comes out wrong 3 times running. Once, dusting near enough to see, you noticed the book opened on her lap during a rare unsupervised minute wasn't the assigned history at all, but something slighter. A novel borrowed, you'd guess, from the Baroness's own more forgiving shelf. And she caught you noticing, and, instead of the composed, dutiful mask you're used to, gave you something startlingly close to a conspirator's small grin before the book vanished back beneath the official one at the sound of footsteps in the passage. You said nothing. You have never said anything about it since. Not even to Peg, and you understood in that unguarded half-second something about her that 4 months of watching her face every morning hadn't quite taught you yet. That whatever the system has built around her, however completely it fills her days and reads her diary and counts her stairs, there is still somewhere underneath all of it an ordinary girl who wants, now and again, simply to read something nobody assigned her, and to share the small, illicit pleasure of it with someone who won't report the offence. The Baroness is the one person in this house who frightens you and comforts you in equal measure, sometimes within the same 5 minutes. Louise Letson came from Hanover decades ago as a clergyman's daughter with nothing but her wits, and she has made herself indispensable to a household that would otherwise have swallowed the princess whole. She is thin as a birch switch, dresses always in the same dark stuff gowns, and smells permanently of the caraway seeds she chews for her stomach, a smell you will associate with safety for the rest of your life, without ever quite understanding why. She does not smile easily. But she's the only adult in this house who has ever, in 4 months, asked you your name and used it correctly the second time. "You're new," she said to you the first week, catching you rigid with fear over a dropped coal scuttle. Soot scattered black across the hearthrug you had just beaten clean. "Prentice, isn't it?" "Yes, my lady." "I'm not a lady. I'm a baroness and a poor one, and you may call me ma'am like everyone else." A pause while she looked at the soot and at you and seemed to weigh something. "Clean it before the Duchess wakes and I'll say nothing. Clean it after and I'll have to. Which would you prefer?" You cleaned it before. You have never dropped a coal scuttle since. Not because you were punished, because you weren't, but because she gave you a choice in a house where almost nobody below the rank of Duchess is ever given one, and you have wanted every day since to deserve that kind of trust. The other adult who governs this household, and governs it far more completely than the Duchess herself, is a man named Sir John Conroy, and you learned to fear him before you learned almost anything else, because every servant in the house fears him, from the housekeeper down to the boy who blacks the boots. He is the Duchess's comptroller, her closest adviser. Some of the older servants say more than her adviser in a voice that drops when they say it, and he moves through Kensington Palace as though he already owns it, which in every way that matters he does. He is a tall man, handsome in a hard-groomed way, with pale, watchful eyes that catalogue a room the instant he enters it, tallying who's present, who's listening, what's being said. His voice rarely rises. It doesn't need to. When Sir John Conroy speaks quietly to a footman, the footman's hands shake for an hour afterward. It is Conroy, the housekeeper told you in your first week, in the tone people use to explain a fact of weather rather than a fact of politics, who wrote the rules you live by now. The rules that say the princess is never to be alone, not for one uncounted minute, not with a servant, not with a tutor, not even, in practice, with her own thoughts, because someone is always in the room to report what those thoughts produced. The rules that say every letter she writes and every letter she receives passes first across a particular desk before it reaches her hands or leaves the building. The rules that say she is not to walk downstairs without a hand to hold, 22 steps, counted, watched. The Regency Council, should the old king die before she comes of age, is meant by law to include several men. Conroy has spent years arranging quietly, patiently, for the practical exercise of that regency to belong to one woman who trusts him entirely with her judgment and, more than her judgment, with her signature. You didn't understand any of that in your first month. You understood only the rules themselves, the 22 steps, the shared bedroom, the diary read nightly, the strange hush that falls over any room Conroy enters, the way the princess's shoulders come up half an inch when his voice sounds in the corridor outside. You understood the shape of the cage before anyone told you it was a cage, because that is what it is to be a servant in a great house. You see everything and are told nothing, and you are expected to make your own sense of it quietly, and never to say what you've made. By 7 the fire is drawing properly, and you move on to the washing water, hauled up 2 flights from the scullery in a can that weighs more than you'd like to admit it does after the second flight. Your arm burning by the last landing, water slopping over the rim and scalding your wrist where it splashes, because it has to be hot enough to still be warm by the time it reaches the basin, and the only way to manage that is to carry it too hot and pay for the mistake in small burns across your knuckles that never quite have time to heal before the next morning adds new ones. You set the can beside the washstand. You lay out the linen towel folded in thirds the way Mrs. Lewis taught you, and you retreat to the corner of the room to wait, because part of your job, whether the room's occupants are awake or not, is simply to be present, available, silent, a fixture, like the andirons. The Duchess of Kent wakes first most mornings, a heavy-set woman with a broad, handsome, anxious face, already talking before her eyes are properly open, usually to the room in general rather than to any person in it, a habit you've come to understand as nerves rather than grandeur. She speaks German as often as English in the mornings, low and rapid, and you don't understand more than a word in 10, but you understand the tone of it, the way she reaches for the day already braced against some disaster that hasn't happened yet. The princess wakes differently. She wakes all at once, no drowsy half-hour, eyes open and immediately alert, the way you imagine a soldier must wake, and for 1 or 2 seconds every single morning, before she remembers where she is and what the day requires of her, you catch something on her face that you don't have a better word for than hunger. Then it's gone, folded away behind the composed, dutiful expression she wears the rest of the day, and she says good morning to her mother in French, because French before breakfast is one of Baroness Leighton's rules, and the day's machinery starts turning. You have learned her face better than you've learned almost anyone's, because watching faces without seeming to watch them is most of what your job actually consists of, whatever the housekeeper's list of duties says. She is not a beauty. Not yet. Not by the standards the older housemaids gossip about when they compare her to portraits of her cousins. She is short, shorter than you, with pale, prominent blue eyes and a small, determined chin, and a habit, when she's holding her temper, of pressing her lips together until they go white at the corners. She holds her temper often. You have seen, twice now in 4 months, what happens on the rare occasion she doesn't, and both times it involves Sir John Conroy, and both times the room was cleared of servants so fast you barely had time to set down what you were carrying. It's on an ordinary Tuesday in July, hanging washing in the drying room with the window propped for air, that the letter first comes into your hands, though you don't understand yet what it is, or what it will cost you to carry it. The washing girl, a stout, cheerful woman named Peg who's worked at Kensington longer than anyone can remember, is folding pillow slips beside you when Susan, one of the upper housemaids assigned to the Duchess's own rooms, slips into the drying room with her face carefully arranged into nothing at all, which is how you have learned to recognise when Susan is about to ask you for something she shouldn't. Prentice. A word. You follow her into the passage. She presses something small and folded into your palm, no bigger than a playing card, sealed with a blob of plain wax and no crest. For the princess, into her hand, nobody else's, not the Baroness, not anybody. She'll know what it is. Where does it come from? Susan's mouth thins. Don't ask me that. Don't ask anyone that. You didn't get it from me either, if it comes to it. You should say no. Every rule you've been taught in 4 months says you should say no, should march it straight to Mrs. Louis, should have nothing to do with anything that moves through this house without Sir John Conroy's knowledge, because you understand by now, in your bones, if not in words, that nothing is supposed to move through this house without Sir John Conroy's knowledge. That is the entire point of the system. But you think of the 4 words you saw in the diary, I wish I might go out, and the line drawn beneath them, and you think of the 2 seconds every morning when her face shows something before it remembers to stop, and you close your fingers around the little folded paper, and you say nothing at all, which Susan seems to understand as agreement, because she's gone back down the passage before you've decided anything. You learn later, much later, pieced together from things the Baroness lets slip, and things Susan tells you over the following months in careful fragments, that the letters are from Princess Feodora, the Duchess of Kent's older daughter from her first marriage, the princess's own half-sister, who grew up in this same house and shared this same governess, and was, by every account you ever hear, the one person Victoria loved without complication or fear. Feodora was married off to a minor German prince 3 years ago, at 20, in a wedding the older servants remember as unusually swift, unusually convenient, arranged, they say, though never where Conroy might hear it, because a grown daughter with no fortune of her own, and a strong attachment to her little sister, was an inconvenience to a man building a system that depended on that little sister having no confidant in the world besides himself and her mother. Feodora writes anyway. She writes, the housemaids whisper, letters full of things she never says in the ones that pass openly through Conroy's desk, and they come by whatever crooked, whispered channel Susan and the other upper servants have built between themselves, hand to hand, pocket to pocket, until they reach a girl low enough in the household to be beneath Sir John Conroy's notice, and high enough in the princess's own rooms to put a folded paper directly into her hand. You are that girl now, apparently. You didn't ask to be. You're not sure you could have refused. Your chance comes at 4:30, when the princess returns from her walk in the gardens, that daily hour of enforced exercise taken always with the Baroness on one side and, more often than not, Conroy's own daughter Victoire on the other, because Victoire Conroy is very nearly the only companion of her own age the princess is permitted, which tells you something about the system's design if you think about it for more than a moment. And you have started these past weeks to think about it for more than a moment. She comes into the schoolroom to change her gloves before dinner, and for perhaps 90 seconds, while the Baroness is occupied at the door instructing a footman about the dinner hour, you're alone with her in the room. 90 seconds. You will remember counting them. You cross to the small table where she's setting down her bonnet, ostensibly to straighten the chair, and you let the folded paper drop from your sleeve onto the table's edge, half beneath the bonnet's brim, and you say nothing, and she says nothing, but her hand moves faster than you've ever seen it move, quick and certain as a bird taking a crumb, and the paper vanishes into the small pocket sewn into her skirt before the Baroness has finished a sentence at the door. She looks at you then, just once, just for a second. Her pale eyes are steady, and something in them, some weight you can't name, eases very slightly, the way your own shoulders ease when you finally set down the water can at the top of the stairs. "Thank you, Prentice," she says, in the same even well-bred voice she'd used to thank you for mending a torn hem, and turns away to strip off her gloves, and that is the entire exchange, and it is also, you understand with a lurch somewhere under your ribs, the single most dangerous thing you have done since you arrived at Kensington Palace. You should understand, if you're going to understand anything about this house, why a folded letter matters as much as it does here, when in most houses in England a letter between sisters would be nothing at all, would draw no attention, would need no smuggling. Kensington Palace has stood on this ground, in one form or another, since the last years of the previous century before this one, a red brick house bought by a Dutch-born king who wanted somewhere with cleaner air than the river fog of Whitehall. and enlarged over the following 140 years by architects and monarchs, until it became this strange, sprawling, half-grand, half-shabby thing you now scrub the hearths of every morning. The name itself is nothing more than the old manor of Kensington. The village that stood here before the palace swallowed it, and that's precisely what it still is underneath the state apartments and the gilt. A village-sized household with village-sized gossip, except that in this particular village-sized household, every rumour, every letter, every unattended minute is a card in a game whose stakes are the government of the entire kingdom, should a sickly 60-something king in Windsor Castle happen to draw his last breath before a certain girl turns 18. That is the arithmetic none of the housemaids say aloud, but every one of you carries in your head from the day you're hired. King William IV is old and unwell, and has no legitimate children who survived him, and the throne after him passes by the plain unbending law of succession to the girl whose bedroom you clean every morning, unless she should die first, which everyone in the household knows has very nearly happened once already, and might, God forbid, happen again. And if the king dies while she is still a minor, before her 18th birthday, the law provides for a regent to govern in her name until she comes of age, and the person best positioned by years of careful engineering to control that regent absolutely is a man with pale, watchful eyes, who is standing at this very moment in the passage outside the schoolroom door, speaking in his low, unhurried voice to the Baroness about the dinner hour, while you straighten a chair that did not need straightening and try to slow your own heartbeat. He doesn't look at you as he passes into the room. He never looks at housemaids. You are furniture to him. Useful furniture. Arranged furniture. But furniture. That's what saves you, you think later. That's the only reason a folded scrap of paper the size of a playing card can travel from a stranger's hand to a princess's pocket in 90 seconds, in a house this watched, because the man doing the watching has never once considered that the danger to his careful arrangements might come from a 16-year-old girl with cracked knuckles who's paid £8 a year to lay fires. That night, lying on the narrow attic bed you share with 2 other under-housemaids, listening to the wind find every gap in the roof slates and the mice working somewhere in the wall behind your head. You go over the 90 seconds again and again. The drop of the paper, the flash of her hand, the 2 words, "Thank you," and you understand, with the particular clarity that comes at the end of a very long day, that you have chosen a side in something you don't fully understand the shape of, and that there will very likely be no going back from having chosen it. You are right about that. You just don't yet know how long it will be before it matters, or how much it will cost, or what you'll be holding in your own hands on the morning it finally does. The autumn comes on wet that year, the gardens beyond the schoolroom windows turning the colour of weak tea, rain drumming on the leads above your attic room most nights, and the work does not slow for weather, only changes its character. Now there are fires to keep fed through the whole grey day instead of just morning and evening, coal dust working itself permanently into the creases of your palms no matter how you scrub, and the damp finds its way into everything, into the linen that never quite dries, into your own boots which are wet through by 9 most mornings, from crossing the yard to the coal store, into the pages of the exercise books which crinkle and buckle if the fire in the schoolroom isn't kept exactly right. You learn to read the sky the way the gardeners do, learn which grey means an hour's respite and which grey means you'll be hauling extra coal by noon, and your hands by November have stopped feeling entirely like your own hands and started feeling like a pair of tools that happened to be attached to your arms, chapped and split at the knuckle, permanently faintly grimed no matter how hard you scrub them with the pumice stone Peg keeps by the scullery sink. Supper in the servants' hall is the 1 hour of the day that belongs more or less to nobody but yourselves. Taken at a long scrubbed table below stairs once the upper household's own dinner has been cleared and the last tray sent up, and you have come over these months to treasure it the particular way you treasure anything scarce. The room is low-ceilinged and always a little too warm from the kitchen fire beyond the wall. Tallow candles guttering in their holders, the smell of the evening's cooking still hanging thick in the air. Boiled mutton most nights, sometimes a bit of fish on a Friday, bread and cheese and small beer poured out generously enough that nobody at the table goes hungry, even if nobody goes particularly satisfied either. Peg presides at one end from long habit and seniority, ladling out whatever's left in the big pot with a practised flick of her wrist, and the talk runs the length of the table in the easy overlapping way. Talk runs among people who've worked alongside each other long enough to have stopped bothering with formality. Footmen compare the day's tips and complain about a particular caller's rudeness. The between maid frets over a sweetheart in the village who hasn't written in a fortnight. Susan most nights says little and listens more, her eyes doing the same careful cataloguing of the room that you've noticed Conroy himself do upstairs, though for entirely different reasons, and you understand, watching her across the candlelight, that a woman who carries secret errands for a living learns early to know exactly who's listening before she opens her own mouth. It's at this table, more than anywhere else in the house, that you piece together the shape of the world you're living inside, because nobody upstairs explains anything to a housemaid directly, and everything you understand about the system, about Conroy's ambitions, about the old king's failing health, about the delicate arithmetic of a girl's approaching 18th birthday, comes to you first as servants' hall gossip, traded back and forth over cooling mutton by people who have, each of them, glimpsed one small corner of the whole picture, and none of whom has glimpsed the entire thing. My cousin's in service at Windsor, a footman named Davy tells the table one November evening, lowering his voice, though there's no earthly reason to, from long habit more than actual need. Says the king can't manage the stairs there without 2 men holding him up on either side. Says his legs have swelled something dreadful. Dropsy, the physicians are calling it, though nobody says the word out loud in front of him. He'll outlive the lot of us out of spite alone, Peg says, not unkindly, ladling out the last of the mutton. Man's hated that woman upstairs for years. Man like that holds a grudge the way other men hold a purse. Tight. Hates the little one's adviser more, my cousin says, Davy goes on. Says the king can't hardly say Conroy's name without his whole face going purple. You eat your supper and say very little, the way you've learned to say very little at this table, listening far more than contributing, and you think, walking up the back stairs afterward with your candle cupped against the draught, about how strange it is that the entire fate of a kingdom seems to hinge, in the end, on the particular timing of one old man's failing legs, discussed over cooling mutton by people none of whom will have the smallest say in how it actually unfolds. All of you simply waiting, the way servants always wait, for decisions made 3 floors above your heads, to finally arrive at your own level and rearrange the whole shape of your days. Some nights the talk turns lighter, and you're grateful for it. Tired enough some evenings that you can barely follow a sentence of political gossip without your eyes drooping over your plate. Peg tells the same 3 stories about her girlhood in Kent that she's told 100 times before and that never fail to draw the same laughter from the table regardless. And one of the younger footmen does an unkind but genuinely funny impression of the under-butler's habit of clearing his throat before every single sentence. And even Susan, on her better evenings, allows herself a small, tight smile at the edge of the candlelight, the closest thing to open amusement you've ever seen cross her careful face. These are the evenings you remember most fondly, decades later, more fondly in some ways than the drama of the letters and the accession that came to define the year in every retelling. The ordinary warmth of a low room full of tired people who liked each other well enough, sharing a meal that wasn't grand but was hot and plentiful, laughing at jokes that wouldn't survive being written down, none of you knowing yet which of you would still be in service together the following year, none of you knowing yet what any of you would eventually be asked to carry. The story that changes the whole temperature of the house reaches you not from a letter this time, but from Susan's own mouth, 3 days after it happens, because Susan had gone with the Duchess's retinue to Windsor for the King's birthday dinner in August, and came back to Kensington white, and shaking and unable, for the better part of an evening, to say anything at all about what she'd seen. It comes out eventually, in the scullery, in pieces, while Peg scours a stock-pot and you dry what she hands you, and neither of you says a word that might make Susan stop talking. The King had 100 guests at his table that night, Susan says, lords and bishops and half the court, and the Duchess of Kent seated near him in a place of honour, and the Princess Victoria seated near her mother, all of them dressed for a celebration. And part way through the dinner, with every one of those 100 guests listening, the old King rose to his feet, and instead of the usual toasts and pleasantries a birthday dinner calls for, he began to speak about the Duchess of Kent directly, by name, in front of her own daughter, in a voice that carried the length of the hall. He said, "Susan tells you, her hands twisting in her apron, that he trusted to God his life would be spared 9 months longer, so that if he died, the sovereign power would pass to the princess personally, direct, and not to a regency under the person now near him, meaning the Duchess, sitting 3 feet away with her face gone the colour of ash. He said he had been grossly and continually insulted by that person, and that he was determined it should cease. He said it all standing in front of the entire table, in front of foreign ministers and bishops, and worst of all, Susan says, her voice cracking in front of the princess herself, 13 years old, sitting between her mother and this old man who was shouting about her mother's unfitness, as though she weren't in the room at all. The Duchess wanted her carriage called that instant, Susan says, wanted to leave in the middle of it in front of everyone, and they had to talk her out of it, had to sit through the rest of the dinner as if nothing had happened, while every soul at that table pretended to look at their plates, and every soul at that table was thinking about nothing else. You think about the princess sitting through the rest of that meal. You think about the 2 seconds every morning when her face shows something before it remembers to compose itself, and you understand more clearly than any explanation Susan could give you exactly what kind of house you're standing in. This is not a house where a girl is protected from the war being fought over her future. It is the house where that war is fought, at the dinner table, over the food, in front of her, because there is nowhere else left for it to be fought, and no version of her life in which she's permitted not to hear it. Nothing changes at Kensington after that dinner, on the surface. The fires still need laying, the water still needs hauling, the lessons still proceed in French and German and the copying out of historical passages, but something underneath the surface has shifted, the way the whole house shifts before a storm even while the sky outside is still clear, and you feel Conroy's presence in the corridors differently after that, sharper, more urgent, a man who has just watched the old king stand up in front of 100 witnesses and declare essentially that he intends to outlive his own hatred of Conroy's system by 9 months out of sheer spite. and who now understands, better than he understood it before, exactly how little time he might actually have. You learn, over that winter, to recognize the sound of a particular kind of silence in the house. The silence that falls when Conroy and the Duchess are shut up together in her private sitting room for an hour at a time, low voices through the door, and the Baroness pacing the passage outside with her lips pressed into a thin line, not permitted in, not able to leave either, standing sentry over a conversation she isn't part of. You learn to recognise, too, a different silence, the one that follows those meetings, when the princess is called in afterward, alone, briefly, and comes out again with her chin set and her shoulders very straight, and says nothing to anyone for the rest of the day, and you understand without being told that whatever is asked of her in that room, she is refusing it. Again, the way you gather, she has refused it before, and that the asking will not stop simply because the answer keeps being no. The letters keep coming through that winter, less often than you'd like, more often than is safe, and you carry them the same way each time, sleeve to table, edge to pocket, 90 seconds or less. Never a word exchanged beyond the two she always offers you. "Thank you, Prentice," in the same even voice, whether the letter contains, as you later learn some of them did, nothing more than news of Feodora's small children in Germany, or whether it contains, as you also later learn some of them did, something closer to comfort for a sister who has just sat through a public humiliation, with no one in the room permitted to comfort her openly. The closest call comes in February, on a morning so cold the water in your washing can has skinned over with ice. By the time you reach the 3rd floor, your fingers gone from aching to numb somewhere around the 2nd flight, and you almost miss your moment because your hands are too clumsy with cold to manage the drop cleanly. The letter, folded smaller than usual, catches on the cuff of your sleeve instead of falling free, and for one long sick second it dangles there, visible, while the Baroness turns from the window where she's been standing. You have never moved so fast in your life without seeming to move at all. You bring your other hand up as if to straighten your own cuff, a housemaid's idle habit, nothing worth noticing, and the letter drops the last 2 inches into your palm and from your palm in the same motion, onto the table's edge beneath the princess's glove, and by the time the Baroness's eyes have finished crossing the room, you're already 3 steps away, folding a shawl that did not need folding, your heart going so hard you're certain that the sound of it must be audible across the room. The Baroness looks at you for a moment longer than is comfortable. She looks, you think afterward, lying awake replaying it, not at your hands or your face, but at something just slightly to the side of you, the way a person looks when they are choosing quite deliberately not to see a thing they have in fact already seen. "Prentice," she says, "that grate wants blacking again before dinner." "Yes, ma'am." Nothing more is said, not that day, not the next. But 3 evenings later, passing you in the passage outside the schoolroom with a candle in her hand, the Baroness stops and you stop, because you do not pass a Baroness in a narrow passage without stopping, and she looks at you for a long moment in the candlelight. "You're a good girl, Prentice," she says quietly, in her heavy German-accented English. "I don't ask you what errands you run for other people in this house. I find, on the whole, it's better for everyone if I don't ask." A pause. Her eyes, pale like the princess's own, hold yours without blinking. "But I will tell you this, because nobody told it to me when I was your age, and I have regretted the not knowing every day since. Loyalty in a house like this one is not the same thing as obedience. Sometimes they point in the very same direction. Sometimes they don't. You'll have to learn, the way I had to learn, which is which, and nobody can learn it for you, and nobody will thank you for getting it right. Because the whole design of a house like this one is to make sure nobody outside it ever finds out there was a choice to get right in the first place. She moves on down the passage before you can find any answer at all, her candle throwing long shadows up the stairwell, and you stand there for a full minute afterward with your own candle guttering in the draught, understanding that you have just been told, as plainly as anyone in this house is ever likely to tell you anything plainly, that she knows exactly what you're carrying between your sleeve and your pocket, and has decided, for reasons she will never explain to a 16-year-old housemaid, to let you go on carrying it. Winter grinds on the way, winter grinds on in a house with 40 cold rooms and 6 warm ones. Your hands more tool than flesh by March, the skin across your knuckles split in 3 places that never fully close because you're forever putting them back in water before they've had the chance. A low persistent ache riding up both forearms by the end of every day, from the hauling and the wringing and the endless working of cloth and coal and stone. You have stopped noticing your own tiredness as a separate thing from yourself. It has become simply the medium you move through, the way fish stop noticing water. You sleep when you sleep, the deep, dreamless collapse of a body that has been given no other choice, and you wake at 5:30 to do it all again, and somewhere in the middle of all that repetition, without quite marking the day it happened, you stopped being the frightened girl who dropped a coal scuttle in her first week, and became instead a girl who can carry a folded secret past the most watchful man in England without her hands shaking, which is either a kind of growing up or a kind of danger, and you're not entirely sure some nights which. March brings your first errand beyond the palace walls in nearly a year of service, sent out with the under-butler's list and a basket over your arm, to fetch particular items from the high street shops that the palace kitchens can't be trusted to supply fresh, a task normally beneath your station that falls to you only because the girl who usually runs it has taken a chill and won't leave her bed. You welcome it more than you'd ever admit to Mrs. Lewis. The simple, animal pleasure of walking somewhere without a bell summoning you back, and you take your time crossing the gardens toward the village proper, breath fogging in the cold morning air, boots crunching frost-stiffened grass along paths still empty of the fashionable strollers who'll fill them by noon. Kensington High Street in March is its own small chaos, nothing like the vast roaring commerce you've heard described of the city proper, but chaos enough for a girl who spent most of the year confined behind one household's walls. Carts rattle past loaded with market produce, their wheels catching in the ruts left by yesterday's rain and not yet dried, and you press yourself against a shop front to let one through, mud spattering up the hem of your skirt regardless. A butcher's boy trots past with a whole carcass over his shoulder, blood soaking dark through the sacking wrapped round it, and the smell of it, iron and meat and the cold morning air, catches in your throat for a moment before the wind carries it off. Somewhere a woman is selling watercress from a basket, her voice cracking on the second syllable of the word from repeating it too many times already that morning, and the baker's window 3 doors down fogs the glass from within with the heat of ovens that have been burning since well before dawn, the smell of new bread reaching you from 20 feet off, warm and yeasty, so different from the cold ash smell you wake to every morning in your own hearthwork that your stomach clenches with a hunger you hadn't noticed until that exact moment. You buy what's on the list, careful with the coins counted into your palm that morning, a household's money and not your own, and you feel the weight of the basket grow steadily on your arm as you work your way down the row of shops, cheese wrapped in muslin, a paper twist of nutmeg, a dozen fresh eggs nested in straw that you carry with both hands cupped beneath the basket's bottom. The whole walk back for fear of a single crack. Your fingers, by the time you turn back toward the palace gates, have gone stiff with cold despite your mittens, the basket's wicker handle biting a groove into the crook of your elbow, and there's a particular satisfaction in that ache you find, different from the dull, grinding fatigue of an ordinary day's fires and water, because this ache came from being out, being someone who walked through a real street full of real strangers who had no idea what household she served or what she carried folded in her sleeve most weeks. You pass, on your way back through the village, a small crowd gathered outside the printseller's window, craning to see a new engraving pinned up behind the glass, and you slow despite yourself, curious, and catch a glimpse over someone's shoulder of the image itself before a man in a good coat shifts and blocks your view entirely. It's the king, or a caricature of him, red-faced and gouty, propped up in a great chair with doctors clustered round like carrion birds, and beneath it a caption you can't quite read from this angle, but that draws a low ripple of laughter from the men nearest the glass. You think, standing there with your basket of eggs and cheese and nutmeg, of the old king somewhere at Windsor at this exact moment, breath coming shorter every week by every account you've heard in the servants' hall, and of the girl sleeping 200 feet from your own attic bed, who has no earthly control over the timing of what that print-seller's window is already, cruelly, gently mocking in advance, and you feel something you don't have a tidy word for, not quite pity, not quite dread, something closer to the cold, clear feeling of watching a clock you can hear ticking but can't see the face of. You're back at the palace gates within the hour, cheeks wind-burned and fingers aching properly now with the cold, and Mrs. Louis inspects your basket's contents with the brisk efficiency of a woman who has never once in her life trusted a servant's honesty without checking it, and finds nothing amiss, and sends you straight back to the fires with barely a word of thanks, and you go, glad of the excuse to warm your hands again, carrying the smell of fresh bread and the sound of that ripple of laughter outside the print shop with you the rest of the day. Small souvenirs of a world beyond the walls that you will not see again, uninterrupted, for the better part of another year. There is one place in the whole of Kensington Palace where nobody's rules reach you, and you find it almost by accident in April, chasing a jackdaw's nest of loose slate that the housekeeper once reported before the spring rains get in properly. A narrow door off the top-floor linen passage, easy to miss, opens onto a leaded gutter walk running along the roofline above the state apartments, and the first time you push through it and straighten up into the open air, the wind nearly takes your cap off, and you understand, all at once, why nobody bothers to forbid housemaids from coming up here. Nobody imagines a housemaid would want to. You come to love it anyway, in the stolen 10 minutes you can sometimes claim between the dinner service and the evening fires, when the light is going long and gold across Kensington Gardens, and the whole tangled, watched, breathless machinery of the household falls away beneath your feet like something happening to someone else. From up here you can see over the garden wall to where the gardens themselves roll out toward the Serpentine. Elm avenues laid out with the geometry no rule of Sir John Conroy's has ever touched. Deer moving in the deer paddock like slow grey punctuation marks, and beyond that, hazed with coal smoke even on a clear evening, the whole enormous huddle of London itself, church spires rising out of the murk, the dome of St. Paul's just visible on the clearest days like a grey knuckle against the sky. 500,000 people live and work and starve and profit somewhere out there beneath that haze, entirely unaware that a girl not yet 18 years old sleeping in a shared bed not 200 feet from where you're standing, is going to determine the shape of their government, their laws, their coinage, possibly their wars, for however many decades God grants her, and that right now, tonight, that same girl is not permitted to walk down a staircase without someone's hand in hers. It strikes you up here, in a way it never quite does down in the passages and the schoolroom, how strange the whole arrangement is. Down below, inside the system, everything feels enormous and immovable, the rules pressing in from every side like the walls of a room too small for the person living in it. Up here you can see the room from outside, see how small it actually is. One household, one anxious mother, one ambitious man, one governess doing what she can from inside a cage she didn't build either, all of it perched on top of an empire that stretches. So your reading of the newspapers Peg sometimes smuggles from the servants' hall tells you, halfway round the created world, ships and colonies and coinage flowing out from this city in every direction. None of it knowing or caring that its future sovereign counted 22 stairs every night of her life before she was permitted to reach the bottom of them. You think, up on the leads with the wind pulling at your apron strings, about what you're carrying in your sleeve most weeks now, and about the Baroness's words in the passage, loyalty is not the same as obedience, and about the 2 seconds every morning when the princess's face shows something before it remembers to stop, and you think, not for the first time, that whatever is coming for this house, it is coming soon, because you can feel the whole structure of it straining the way a roof strains before a heavy snow, and something in a structure that strained that long eventually has to give. There is one other resident of Kensington Palace you have not yet told you about, an old man who keeps his own apartments in a separate wing entirely, and crosses paths with the Duchess's household rarely enough that you have spoken to him directly only twice in your whole 4 years of service, though both times have stayed with you. He's the Duke of Sussex, one of the old king's own brothers, a vast, white-bearded, kindly figure who dresses always in a black skull cap on account of his weak eyes and asthma, and who is known throughout the household, in whispers that carry real affection, rather than the careful blankness reserved for Conroy, as the one member of the wider royal family who's never once had a harsh word for the princess, or, more remarkably, for her mother. The first time you speak to him is an April afternoon, sent to carry a message across the gardens to his household, and you find him seated on a bench near his own private door with a book open on his knee that he isn't, you notice, actually reading, his pale, weak eyes fixed instead on the far figure of the princess, walking her required hour with the Baroness on one side and Victoire Conroy on the other, small and dutiful and precisely as watched as she is every single day of her life. "You're one of the Duchess's girls," he says, not unkindly, as you approach with your message, and you bob a curtsy and confirm it. And he nods slowly, still watching the small distant procession cross the lawn. "I watch her walk most fine afternoons, you know. Same hour, same path, same 2 companions, week after week, have done for years." A pause, his breath catching faintly, an old man's wheeze beneath the words. "My own nieces and nephews ran wilder than that at her age. Ran wild enough to break their necks twice over, some of them. God rest the ones who did. I sometimes think there might be a middle way between breaking your neck and never once being allowed to walk anywhere unaccompanied. But nobody's asked my opinion on the household's management, and at my age and with my chest, I haven't the wind left to volunteer it uninvited. You don't know what to say to that. A housemaid being addressed almost as an equal by a royal duke, and you settle for another curtsy and the message you were sent to deliver, and he takes it with a small private smile that suggests he knows precisely how little a housemaid can safely say in answer to a complaint about the household that employs her. Tell her, if you ever have the chance, and I don't suppose you will, he says as you turn to go, that her old uncle thinks she's bearing up remarkably well, under a weight most grown men I know would have set down years ago. He taps his book closed, not having read a page of it. Though, perhaps don't tell her exactly that. Tell her something that sounds less like an old man feeling sorry for her. She wouldn't thank you for the pity, whatever else she might thank you for. You never do find a way to pass along any version of that message, not directly. Though you think, watching her face across a crowded room some weeks later, that she perhaps already knows there's at least one relative in this palace who sees her plainly and doesn't like what the seeing shows him, and that the knowing itself, even unspoken, might be its own small comfort in a house that offers her precious few. May comes in warmer than the servants expected, the gardens greening fast, and with the warmth comes news from Windsor that runs through the house like a current through water, before any one official says a word about it. The king is failing. Dropsy, the older footmen say, shaking their heads with the particular relish servants reserve for a death they expect to change everyone's circumstances but their own, water gathering round his heart and his lungs, his breath coming shorter every week, his doctors no longer troubling to sound hopeful in their bulletins, and every soul in Kensington Palace, from the housekeeper down to the boot boy, does the same arithmetic at the same moment, because it is the only arithmetic that has mattered in this house for years. The princess turns 18 on the 24th of this month. If the king dies before that date, England gets a regent, and everyone in this house, everyone, knows exactly whose hand would be on the reins of that regency in all but name. You watch Conroy in those last weeks of May the way you'd watch weather building on a horizon. Watch him move faster through the passages. Watch his low, unhurried voice grow, very slightly, less unhurried. Watch the meetings behind the Duchess's closed door grow longer and more frequent. And twice, walking past that door with an armful of linen, you hear, muffled through the wood, a young voice, controlled, precise, cutting through the low, urgent murmur of the older ones. No, just that. No. Once, and then a silence. And then, some minutes later, again. No. The 24th of May arrives, and the king is still, by God's mercy or sheer stubbornness, alive at Windsor, and the whole household exhales at once, though nobody says so aloud, and there is a modest birthday held for the princess. Cake and a concert in the evening, and gifts arranged on the table in the drawing-room, and you carry trays and clear glasses and catch. Once, across the crowded room, the princess's eyes finding yours for exactly as long as it takes to say, without a word passing between you, that she knows precisely what has been avoided by 3 weeks, and precisely how little margin that leaves. She is 18 now, of age by the law of the land, whatever happens next. No regent required should the worst come. But you understand, watching Conroy's face across that same crowded room, jaw tight beneath his composed public smile, that 18 years old and a legal majority is not the same thing, in his calculations, as being finally entirely beyond his reach. There is still the office of private secretary to be secured, still a signature he has spent years angling to obtain. Still, he clearly believes time enough to arrange things properly if only he is patient a little longer, careful a little longer, persistent a little longer. He does not know that May evening exactly how little longer he has. June comes in close and thundery, the air over the gardens thick enough some afternoons to taste, and the bulletins from Windsor grow shorter and grimmer by the week, the King's doctors no longer writing round the truth of it. Dropsy, then congestion of the lungs. Then, in the last week, a word the footmen say only in a lowered voice, as though saying it plainly might hasten the thing itself. Dying. You're called, on the 14th of June, to carry a supper tray up to the small sitting room where the Duchess and Conroy have been closeted for the better part of 2 hours, and you arrive at the door just as it opens from within, the Baroness stepping out ahead of you with a face like a shut window, and behind her, through the gap before the door swings to, you catch 3 seconds of a scene you will carry with you the rest of your life. The Princess is standing, not sitting, in the middle of the room, very straight, very pale, a paper on the table before her with an inkstand set out beside it, as though everything has already been arranged, and only her hand is required to finish the arrangement. Conroy is standing too, close, closer than is proper, his voice pitched low and reasonable, in the particular way you have learned means he believes he is winning. Only sensible, only prudent, given the circumstances, and you would want for nothing. You would want for nothing at all, only to trust the good sense of those who have guided you your whole life, who understand these matters far better than... The door swings shut on the rest of it. You stand there with the tray, heart going hard, and the Baroness takes it from your hands without a word and sends you back downstairs with a look that tells you plainly this is not a supper that will be wanted after all. You learn what happened in that room only in fragments, over the following days, the way you learn most things in this house, half from Susan and half from things you overhear and piece together yourself, that Conroy pressed her, again, as he had pressed her at Ramsgate 2 autumns before when she lay burning with fever and too weak to hold a pen steady, and had still, even then, even half out of her senses, found the strength to refuse him, to make him a private secretary now, before anything could happen to the king, so that whatever came, whenever it came, the machinery would already be in place and require no further argument. That she stood in that room and said no to him again, the same word you'd heard through the door weeks before. No, though her hands were shaking badly enough by the end, Susan says, that Letson had to help her from the room. You think about that word. No, said over and over across nearly 2 years by a girl who has never in her whole remembered life been allowed to walk down a staircase alone, and you understand that whatever else this system has done to her, it has not managed to do the one thing it was built to do. It has not taught her to say yes to a man simply because saying no exhausts her. The 19th of June is a Monday, close and grey, rain threatening all day and never quite arriving, and it's past 10 at night. The household mostly settled, when Susan finds you in the linen passage with a folded paper in her hand and an expression on her face you haven't seen before. Something closer to fear than the careful blankness she usually wears when she hands you these errands. "One more," she says, "tonight. Now, if you can manage it before everyone's abed." "Now? It's gone 10. "I know what hour it is, Prentice. Take it or don't, but take it now." You don't ask why the urgency. You've learned by now not to ask. You tuck the small folded paper into your sleeve, the same place it's always ridden, and you make your way toward the princess's rooms through a house gone quiet and shadowed, candles guttering low in their sconces, and you reach the passage outside her door only to find it, for the first time in nearly a year of these errands impossible. A footman stationed outside, awake, alert, the household's whole rhythm somehow already disturbed, though you don't yet know why. Lights burning later than they should in the Duchess's rooms, low voices moving through the house that shouldn't still be moving at this hour. You wait in the shadow of the linen closet doorway for the better part of an hour, the letter growing warm and slightly damp against your wrist from your own nervous sweat, watching the footman who does not move from his post. And somewhere past 11 you understand that tonight, for the first time, you're not going to be able to deliver it, and you retreat to your own attic room with the folded paper still tucked in your sleeve, meaning to try again at first light, not yet knowing, as you finally fall into an uneasy sleep sometime past midnight. That first light is going to arrive at Kensington Palace faster and stranger than any morning of your whole 4 years there, and that the letter in your sleeve is never going to reach the hand it was written for. Not tomorrow. Not for a very long time after that. You wake to a sound that doesn't belong in the hour it arrives in. Not the bell. Not the housekeeper's knuckles on the attic door. A carriage below in the forecourt, wheels loud on gravel at an hour when no carriage has any business arriving, horses blowing hard, and beneath that voices urgent, a bell being rung at the palace's own outer door and rung again before anyone answers it. You sit up in the dark attic room, the other 2 girls stirring beside you, and somewhere below you hear a door bang, and feet, many feet, moving fast through passages that are supposed to be silent at this hour. It's not yet 5. You can tell by the quality of the light through the tiny attic window, that particular grey-blue that comes before the sun but after the true dark, the hour when even the birds haven't fully committed to the day. Mrs. Louis is at your door within minutes, candle in hand, her nightcap still on, her face doing something you've never seen it do before, struggling to hold its own composure and losing. Up, dressed, now. There's water wanted, and candles lit through the whole east passage, quick as you can manage it. What's happened? Never mind what's happened. Move. You move. You're downstairs and dressed and lighting sconces along the east passage within 10 minutes, hands fumbling with the tinderbox because they're shaking, though you couldn't say yet whether from cold or from the current running through the whole house. A current you can feel through the soles of your feet on the cold boards, a current that says something enormous is happening 2 floors above you, and every servant in the building is being swept along in its wake without being told what it is. You learn it in pieces, the way you learn everything in this house. From a footman passing at a near run with a face gone the colour of tallow, Lord Conyngham, the Lord Chamberlain himself, arrived from Windsor with the Archbishop of Canterbury at his side, both of them having ridden through the night, both of them refused entry at first by a porter's gate that wouldn't open fast enough for men carrying the only news that mattered in the whole kingdom, both of them finally admitted and standing now, at this moment, in the ground floor hall, waiting. The king is dead. 2 words, past footman to housemaid to scullery girl through a house waking up all at once into its own history. And you stand in the east passage with the lit taper in your shaking hand and understand, with a clarity that goes through you like cold water, precisely what those 2 words mean for the girl sleeping 2 floors above you. Not sleeping any longer. You can hear it now, faintly, through the walls and the floor, movement in the Duchess's rooms, a door, low voices, and then, very clearly, one voice, sharper than the others, cutting through. I wish to see the Queen alone. The Baroness's voice. You would know it anywhere by now, that careful German-shaped English, but you have never heard it pitched quite like that. Urgent and absolutely immovable, and you understand, standing frozen in the passage with your taper burning down toward your fingers, that something is happening above you that has never happened once in the whole of the 4 years you have served in this house. She's being woken, not by a housemaid with a coal scuttle, by her own governess shaking her gently from the bed she has shared with her mother every single night since before she could walk, to tell her that the king is dead, and that she is, as of some hour past 2 in the morning at Windsor Castle, sovereign of the entire realm, and that 2 men who have travelled through the night to say so are waiting for her, alone, downstairs, alone. You think of the 22 steps. You have thought of them nearly every day for 4 years, the rule that governed the whole architecture of her childhood, never without a hand to hold. And you understand, standing in the passage with your taper guttering, that whatever happens in the next 10 minutes, that rule has already, silently, irrevocably, ended. The footman who comes past a second time, breathless, tells you the rest before you've had time to ask for it. She rose without waiting for anyone to dress her properly, threw a dressing gown over her night-clothes, her hair still loose down her back, no time and, you understand, watching the footman's face, no wish for the usual half-hour of pinning and lacing that would normally stand between her and the world. And she went down, alone, past the housemaids frozen at their posts along the staircase she has walked every single day of her life, with someone else's hand folded around hers, down the 22 steps she has counted in her sleep since before she could read, and this time, for the first time, with no one beside her at all, because the 2 men waiting in the hall below were not there to see a girl. They were there to kneel to a queen, and a queen, whatever else is true of her, does not require a hand to hold on a staircase. You are close enough, when it happens, pressed flat against the passage wall with your dying taper, to see the very end of it. The small figure in the loose white gown, hair unbound, feet in slippers, crossing the last few steps into the hall below with her chin lifted and her spine very straight, the way you have seen her hold herself through 100 smaller ordeals over 4 years, the temper controlled, the face composed, except that this time there is nothing beneath the composure that looks like fear at all. Lord Conyngham drops to one knee on the cold stone floor. The Archbishop beside him does the same, and in a voice you have heard countless times reading French verbs at a schoolroom table, steady, clear, carrying further than a voice her size has any right to carry, she says something you cannot hear the whole of from where you're standing, only the shape of it, only that it is brief, and that it does not shake. Then it is over. 10 minutes, perhaps less, and something that has been building in this house for 4 years, for 18 years, for the whole of her remembered life, has simply, finally arrived. The house does not stop moving after that. If anything, it moves faster, 100 small urgent tasks cascading down from the new order of things before the sun is even properly up, and you're swept into the middle of it within the hour, sent up to the bedroom you know better than almost any room in the world, with instructions that stop you cold in the doorway. Her Majesty, Mrs. Lewis says, and you notice, even through your own bewilderment, the strange new weight the housekeeper puts on those 2 words, testing them, still unused to the shape of them in her own mouth, wishes her bed moved, out, into the small room across the passage by this evening, and she wishes this morning to be left alone for 1 hour, entirely alone, no one is to disturb her. You have never once in 4 years of service heard those words attached to this particular girl. Alone, entirely alone. You stand in the doorway of the room you have cleaned every single morning since you were 16 years old. The two beds still pushed close together the way they have been pushed together every night of her whole remembered life, and you understand that you are looking right now at the very last morning that arrangement will ever exist, because somewhere in this palace, in whatever room she is retreated to, a girl not yet a full day into her reign has used the very first exercise of a power nobody has ever let her exercise before to ask for the one thing the system was built, from its very foundations, to make certain she never had. An hour alone. You help move the bed that evening, you and 2 footmen and Peg, hauling it frame by frame down the passage into the small room that will be hers and hers alone from this night forward, and your arms ache with the weight of it, the way they've ached with 100 other burdens over 4 years. Water cans and coal scuttles and baskets of wet linen, except that this ache feels different, feels almost like a kind of privilege, because you understand, better than most of the household does, exactly what this particular piece of furniture has represented, and exactly what it means that it is finally, at 18 years and 27 days old, being allowed to stand in a room of its own. You think in the days that follow more than you'd expected to about the Duchess of Kent, standing somewhere in the middle of all this transformation, with a role that has shifted more completely than almost anyone else's in the household. She's not a villain in this story, whatever the servants' hall gossip sometimes makes her sound like, bundled together carelessly with Conroy's name, as though the two of them were a single scheming animal with 2 heads. She is, you've come to understand across 4 years of watching her wake anxious and talk too fast, and reach compulsively for reassurance from whichever adviser happens to be nearest. A woman who came to a foreign country as a young widow with an infant daughter and precious little English and precious little money of her own, and who fastened onto Conroy's confident management of her affairs the way a person fastens onto anything solid in a life that has otherwise offered her very little solid ground to stand on. She loved her daughter. You never once doubted that, watching her across 4 years of shared meals and shared bedrooms and shared anxious mornings. She simply loved her in a manner that left no room in it for trusting her, which is its own particular kind of grief for a mother to cause and a daughter to survive. You see her only once in the days immediately following the accession, crossing a passage with her eyes red-rimmed and her usual rapid, anxious talk gone entirely silent, and something in her face in that unguarded moment looks less like a woman who has lost a decade's careful strategy, and more like a woman who has simply, belatedly, understood that her daughter grew up somewhere along the way without her quite noticing it happen, the way all mothers eventually understand it, only crueler in her case, and later, in front of a world that would spend the rest of the reign discussing exactly how it happened. She does not disappear from her daughter's life, not entirely, not immediately. The two of them find, over the years that follow, by every account that reaches you, a slow and imperfect peace with each other that neither Conroy's ambitions nor the system's rules ever once permitted them to build while they shared one roof and one watched bedroom. But that peace, when it comes on the daughter's terms, in the daughter's time, the way everything from that June morning forward comes on the daughter's terms, and you think there is something almost merciful in that. A slower, gentler unwinding of a bond that had grown over 18 watched years into something closer to a cage shared by two frightened people than a home shared by a mother and her child. Sir John Conroy, you learn over the following days, pieced together in the scullery the same way you've pieced together everything else in this house, was not in the hall to see any of it. He arrived later that morning, composed, confident still, apparently still believing, even after everything, that his years of careful arrangement had not been wholly undone by one old man's stubborn heart finally giving out 3 weeks after a birthday. He requested an audience. He was, Susan tells you, her eyebrows still faintly raised at the memory 2 days on, kept waiting in a house he had run in all but name for a decade by a girl of 18 who had learned, apparently in the space of a single night, precisely how to make a man wait. The first Privy Council meets that same morning in the Red Saloon on the ground floor, more than 90 men crowded into a room built for a fraction of that number. Dukes and bishops and ministers who have governed the greatest empire in the created world, summoned on a single morning's notice to watch a girl they have mostly never met take the oath that makes her their sovereign in fact as well as in name. You're not in that room, of course. No housemaid is, and you spend the whole of that particular hour hauling extra chairs and refreshments to a doorway you're not permitted through, catching only glimpses through the gap when the footmen open and close it. But the accounts come back to the servants' hall within the day, from men who were there, from the Duke of Wellington's own valet who has a cousin among the Kensington footmen, and every account agrees on the same astonishing detail, repeated with a kind of wonder that tells you these were men not easily made to wonder at anything. She entered alone. She sat alone, without her mother beside her, without Conroy anywhere near her, and she read the declaration they'd prepared for her in a voice that did not waver, and when it came to answering the questions put to her, she answered them herself, in her own words, composed, brief, entirely her own, and 90 men who had walked into that room half expecting to manage a frightened girl walked out of it, by every account you hear, faintly astonished at having met a queen instead. You think, hearing this second-hand and third-hand over the following days, of the 2 seconds every single morning for 4 years, when her face showed something before it remembered to compose itself back into duty. You think that whatever that hidden thing was, whatever she was holding back behind the careful, dutiful mask the system required of her every day of her life, it was apparently not fear. It was something closer to readiness, banked low and patient for years, waiting only for the door to finally actually open. Conroy does not vanish from the house overnight. Men like him rarely do. He remains for weeks, then months, still angling, still writing memoranda. Nobody now troubles to answer promptly. Still, the older servants tell you with something between pity and satisfaction, behaving as though the ground beneath his feet has not entirely shifted. But you can see it happening even in the small daily texture of the house. The way his voice in the corridors no longer produces the same instant hush it once did. The way the Duchess herself, freed at last from the necessity of managing a regency that never came to pass, begins very slowly to occupy her own rooms and her own decisions in a manner you have never once seen in 4 years of service. Within a year he will be gone from the immediate household entirely, pensioned off with a title and a settlement and a bitterness by every report that reaches you that never once softens for the rest of his life. The system he spent a decade building around a helpless child dissolves, in the end not because anyone tore it down, but because the child it was built to contain simply stood up one grey June morning and walked out the door of it alone. you still have the letter. It sits through those first mad days folded into the lining of your workbox, this same small square of paper that never made it past a footman standing guard on the night of the 19th of June. And for 3 weeks you carry the private, gnawing worry of it, the way you might carry a stone in your shoe, small and constant and impossible to entirely forget. Even in the middle of every other duty the accession has piled onto the household. You don't know how to deliver a private letter to a queen. The rules that governed your old errand, sleeve to table, edge to pocket, 90 seconds unnoticed, belonged to a girl who was never alone, and therefore could always be reached by someone quiet enough. The woman who has replaced that girl is alone constantly now, by her own new command, and paradoxically far harder for a housemaid to approach than she ever was before. Hedged about now not by Conroy's watchfulness, but by the whole enormous formal machinery of a court reorganizing itself around her. Your chance comes in the middle of July, on an ordinary Tuesday not unlike the one that started all of this a year before, when you're sent up with fresh linen to the small room across the passage, the one with the single narrow bed that used to stand crowded beside her mother's and now stands alone, and you find her there without an attendant for once, seated at the same small writing table you've dusted around 1,000 mornings, a pen in her hand, and an unfinished letter of her own beneath it. She looks up when you enter. Something in her face, seeing you, changes very slightly. A small softening you recognize because you have been watching that face for a year and have learned its smallest weathers. Prentice, your Majesty. You have practiced the words. They still feel enormous in your mouth. You set down the linen. Your hands are shaking, you notice distantly. The same way they shook the very first time you carried one of these letters, a year and a lifetime ago. You reach into your apron pocket and draw out the small folded paper, worn soft now at its creases from 3 weeks against your body, and you hold it out without a word because you find, in the moment itself, that you have no idea what words could possibly explain it. She takes it, turns it over once in her hands, and you watch her recognize the seal, the hand, the particular fold that has always meant the same thing arriving from the same distant sister, and something crosses her face that is not quite grief, and not quite joy, but stands very close to both of them at once. "The 19th, she says quietly, not quite a question, reading something in the paper's own worn softness that tells her, better than you could, exactly how long it has waited. "There was a man at your door that night, Mum. I couldn't reach you. I've kept it safe since." She's quiet for a long moment, turning the letter over once more in her hands. When she looks up at you again, there is something in her expression you have never seen directed at you before. Not gratitude exactly, something plainer and steadier than gratitude. "You might have burned it," she says, "once everything changed. Easier, surely, than keeping a secret errand for a girl who no longer needed one run for her at all." "It wasn't mine to burn, ma'am." She nods slowly, as if this answers something she'd actually been wondering, and sets the letter down on the table before her, not yet opened, saving it, you understand, the way a person saves the last good thing in a difficult day, for the quiet hour when they can properly sit with it. "Thank you, Prentice," she says, the same 2 words she has said to you perhaps 30 times over the past year, in the same even, composed voice she has always used for them. But something in the weight of them has changed this once, the way the weight of everything in this house has changed in the past 3 weeks, and you understand, dropping a small curtsy and gathering the empty linen basket to withdraw. that you have just been thanked properly for the first time by a queen. She calls you back before you reach the door. Prentice. You turn. She has opened a small drawer in the writing table and taken out something small enough to close entirely inside her fist, and she crosses the few feet between you and presses it into your palm before you have any chance to protest that servants do not accept such things, that it would not be proper, that you only did what anyone in your position would have done. It is a thimble, small, plain, silver, worn smooth along one edge from use, the kind of ordinary object that might belong to any woman in any household in England, except that when you turn it over, later, alone in the privacy of your own attic room, you find, engraved so small you nearly miss it in the candlelight, a single letter, V. For your trouble, she says, already turning back toward the table and the letter still waiting there, unopened, and the small unfinished letter of her own beneath her pen. Keep it wherever a girl in your position keeps things she isn't meant to have. I think you already know how. You do. You've had a year of practice. The court does not stay at Kensington long. A queen cannot properly govern an empire from a damp red brick house on the edge of the gardens with rats behind half its wainscoting, and within a very few weeks the whole apparatus of the household begins its slow, enormous migration to Buckingham Palace. Wagons of furniture and trunks of linen and crates of the Duchess's belongings, creaking out through the gates you've watched 100 carriages pass through over 4 years, until the rooms you've spent your whole service cleaning stand, one by one, stripped and silent, and finally, properly, as empty as the state apartments always were. You're given the choice, along with most of the lower household, of following the establishment to its new address or remaining in the much reduced staff that will be kept on at Kensington to maintain a palace that royalty, from this summer forward, will visit only occasionally, if at all. Susan goes. Peg goes, grumbling the whole last week about London proper and its prices and its crowds, though you notice she packs her few belongings with more excitement than her grumbling lets on. You, in the end, do not go. It isn't loyalty to the bricks and mortar of the place, whatever the housekeeper who stays on with you seems to assume when she nods approvingly at your decision. It's something closer to exhaustion, if you're honest with yourself in the privacy of your own thoughts. A year of 90-second errands and near discoveries, and a heart that has not, you realize once the immediate danger of it lifts, properly slowed since that February morning with the letter caught on your cuff. You want, for a while at least, a house with fewer secrets in it. Kensington, emptied of its queen, is finally, for the first time since you arrived, exactly that. The Baroness Letson goes to Buckingham Palace with her charge, of course, and remains close to her for some years afterward, though you hear, much later, second-hand, the way you have heard everything of consequence in this story, that even her long devotion does not survive entirely intact the arrival of a young husband a few years on, a German prince named Albert, who has his own clear ideas about how a royal household ought to be run, and no particular patience for a governess's old authority over a wife now fully grown. The Baroness retires eventually back to Hanover, to a small pension and a quiet garden, and you like to think, when you think of her at all in later years, of the caraway smell and the candle in the passage, and the words she gave you that you have never once, in the whole of your life since, managed to entirely put down. Loyalty is not the same thing as obedience. You marry, 3 years after that June morning, a gardener's son named Thomas Aldous, who works the grounds at Holland House not far from Kensington, and you leave service altogether not long after, the way most women in your position eventually do, and you raise 4 children in 2 rented rooms off the high street with a view, from the upper window if you lean out far enough, of the palace's own garden wall. You do not see the Queen again in the whole of your ordinary remaining life. Not once, not even at a distance, though you follow the accounts of her in the newspapers the way half of England does. Her marriage, her children, her long widowhood after the Prince Consort's early death, her jubilees, the sheer improbable length of the reign that began the morning you watched a girl in a white nightgown walk down 22 stairs alone. You keep the thimble your whole life. It sits, for 60 years, in the bottom of a small wooden box that once held your own mother's few possessions, wrapped in a scrap of the same soft flannel you used to line the princess's own work basket, and you take it out sometimes on quiet evenings and turn it over in fingers grown as stiff and roughened with age as your mother's own once were, and you think about a house with 40 cold rooms and 6 warm ones, and a girl who counted stairs, and a letter that arrived 3 weeks too late to matter and mattered anyway. In your last months at Kensington, before you married and left service altogether, they set you to training a new girl in the still room, a nervous thing of 15 named Harriet who flinches at raised voices and drops things when she's frightened, the way you once did, the way every girl who's ever come into a great house half-starved for a wage and wholly unprepared for its rules has always done. You show her how to lay a fire cross-hatched, 3 sticks over 2, how to carry a water can so the weight rides against your hip instead of dragging at your shoulder, how to fold a towel in thirds so it sits square on the rail. You'll drop something eventually, you tell her, the first week when she stands frozen over a shattered dish with her face gone white. Everyone does. The question isn't whether you'll drop it, it's whether you clean it up before anyone finds out or after. She looks at you like you've handed her something more valuable than the broken dish itself, and you understand, watching her carefully sweep the pieces into her apron, that you're passing along, without quite meaning to, the exact shape of a kindness a baroness once did for you in a cold hearthside conversation 4 years before. You do not tell Harriet about the letters. Some things you have learned are not yours to pass down, only yours to have carried, quietly, and then to set down for good when your own carrying is done. You leave Kensington Palace in the spring of 1840, a married woman now, Mrs. Aldous, with a small trunk of belongings that includes, wrapped in flannel at the very bottom, a silver thimble you have told no living soul the full history of, not even Thomas, who assumes, when he notices it at all, that it was simply a keepsake from your years in domestic service, the sort of small thing every long-serving girl comes away with eventually. You let him assume it. Some assumptions are kinder to keep than to correct, and some stories, you have come to believe by then, are not improved by the telling, only worn thinner, the way a coin worn too long in too many pockets eventually loses the face stamped into it. You are 79 years old in the spring of 1899, your hands long past aching from lye and coal, spotted now with age instead of chapped with cold, when your granddaughter Ellen, 16 herself, the same age you were when you first climbed those attic stairs at Kensington, takes you by the arm on a fine April afternoon and tells you she has read in the newspaper that the Queen has ordered the old state apartments open to the public at last, in honour of the 80th birthday she'll mark in a few weeks. And would you like to go, grandmother? Would you like to see it? You have walked past the palace walls 100 times in 60 years of living within a mile of them, have watched the gardens change their fashions in hats and bonnets, and more recently bicycles without once going back inside, and you surprise yourself that April morning by saying yes before you've properly decided to. The queue outside the public entrance is long, ordinary Londoners of every sort, families in their Sunday best, a party of schoolgirls chattering about a princess none of them will ever meet, an elderly gentleman with a guidebook already dog-eared from other palaces, and you stand among them in your best black, leaning on Ellen's young arm, feeling the strange dislocation of waiting to be let into a house you once had a key to. Inside, the state apartments have been dusted and gilded and roped off with red cord, the damp of your memory replaced now by careful preservation, portraits hung where portraits belong, furniture arranged the way furniture is arranged for people who are meant to look and not to touch, and you move through rooms you scrubbed on your knees 60 years before with a kind of vertigo that has nothing to do with your age. A guide in a smart uniform recites dates and names to the little cluster of visitors ahead of you. King William III, Queen Anne, the birth of this prince, the death of that one, and you listen, half amused and half something closer to grief, to how smoothly the whole vast, complicated, aching truth of the place has been folded down into a paragraph fit for a guidebook. He does not mention 22 steps. He does not mention a shared bed pushed close enough for a hand to reach across it, or a diary read nightly by a governess, or a man with pale, watchful eyes who once made grown footmen's hands shake, with nothing more than a lowered voice. He mentions, when you reach the small room off the upper passage, only that this was the chamber in which Her Majesty was born, and that this was the chamber, one June morning in 1837, in which she received the news that made her queen, and the little cluster of visitors nods and murmurs and moves on to the next room, satisfied, having seen precisely as much as they came to see. "Grandmother," Ellen's voice, low, at your elbow. "You've gone quite pale. Are you unwell?" "I'm quite well," you tell her, and you are, though something in your chest has gone tight and strange, standing in a room you once dusted every single morning of a whole difficult year, watching strangers photograph its furniture without the faintest idea that the woman beside them once caught a smuggled letter on her own sleeve, not 4 feet from where they're standing. You do not tell Ellen the whole of it. Not that day, walking back out through the gardens in the late golden light with the ache of standing too long settling into your hips, the way aches settle these days, and not for some years after, though you tell her, eventually, in pieces, the way things were always told to you in this story, half in the scullery and half in a passage by candlelight, until she has, by the time you're gone, very nearly the whole of what you're telling now. What strikes you most, walking home that April afternoon, is not the grandness of the restored rooms, nor the crowd's polite wonder at them. It is the simple, plain fact that every single person in that queue, every schoolgirl and guidebook gentleman and Sunday best family, walked through those rooms and saw exactly nothing of what actually happened in them, and walked out again perfectly satisfied, because that is precisely what the whole arrangement was built to accomplish from the very start. A great house keeps its true history the way it keeps its damp sealed up behind plaster and paint, visible only to the people paid to scrub against it every morning, and even then visible only in fragments, in a diary line glimpsed while dusting, in a word overheard through a closing door, in a letter folded small enough to ride inside a sleeve. The visitors who file through those state apartments now, and the ones who will file through them for 100 years after you're gone, are not meant to know any of it. They were never meant to know any of it. That was the entire design. You knew it anyway. You were there for it. 16 years old, with cracked knuckles and a folded secret riding in your sleeve, and no guidebook, no gilded rope, no polished paragraph recited by a smart young man in uniform will ever change the plain fact that you watched a frightened, controlled, extraordinary girl become a queen alone on a staircase at 5 o'clock in the morning, and that some small unrecorded part of how she managed it passed, at least twice, through your own shaking hands. On quiet evenings in the small back room of the house you shared with Thomas for 40 years, and have kept alone these past 6 since he passed. You sit by the window with your mending in your lap, more from habit than necessity now. Your eyes too weak these days for anything finer than a hem, and you let your mind walk back through that one crowded, difficult, extraordinary year, the way another woman might walk back through a garden she once tended. You think of Peg, gone now these many years, who taught you to fold a pillow slip and fed you gossip along with your dinner, and never once, in all the time you knew her, asked you a question she suspected she wouldn't like the answer to. You think of Susan, who carried a danger to you she never fully explained, and never once thanked you properly for taking it on, though you understood, even then, that the not explaining was its own kind of trust, the kind that assumes you'll understand the stakes without being told them in full. You wonder some evenings whether Susan is still living somewhere, an old woman like yourself, keeping her own version of this same unspoken history behind her own quiet face. You think of the Baroness most of all, more than any of the others, because it was her words in a candlelit passage that gave you the only real instruction you ever received for the whole strange business. Loyalty is not the same as obedience. Words you've turned over in your mind at least once a year for 60 years, applying them to 100 smaller decisions since, a friend's confidence you kept when keeping it cost you something, a wrong you didn't report because reporting it would have served the rule and not the person, and you understand now at the far end of a long ordinary life that she gave you, that evening, not a rule to follow but a burden to carry, the burden of having to decide for yourself every single time which one you were actually looking at. And you think, some evenings, of a September nearly 2 years before the ending you've spent your whole life turning over, when the household went down to Ramsgate for the sea air the doctors thought might strengthen a princess who'd grown thin and pale over a hard winter of lessons, and the princess fell so gravely ill with a fever that burned through her for the better part of a month that the whole household walked on a kind of held breath, servants speaking in whispers past her door, physicians coming and going with faces that told you more than their careful words ever did. You were not yet at Kensington then. You'd come the following spring, and you know the story only as household lore, told and retold in the scullery by servants who had lived through it, but you know it well enough by now to have made it nearly your own memory. How the fever left her too weak to sit upright in bed, how Conroy came to her sick room anyway, again and again, over those burning weeks, a paper in his hand and a pen ready, pressing her, even half delirious, even too weak most days to hold her own head steady on the pillow, to sign the document that would have made him her private secretary before she'd properly recovered enough to understand fully what she was refusing. How she refused him anyway, weak as water, burning with fever, not yet 16 years old, and she still found, from some reserve nobody in that sick room had credited her with possessing, the strength to say no to a grown man standing over her bed with a pen. You did not witness it yourself. You want to be honest with yourself about that, even now, even in the privacy of your own memory, because you have found across a long life that the stories worth telling are the ones told plainly, with their edges left where they actually are, not smoothed over into something grander than what you personally saw. You heard it from women who were there, women who scrubbed the same sick-room floor you'd later scrub 100 nursery floors like it, and you believed them, because the story they told matched, in every particular, the girl you came to know so well the following year. The pressed white lips, the controlled fury, the small unbending word repeated as many times as it needed repeating. Whatever that fever took out of her, it did not take that. You think, too, of Sir John Conroy, though you find at 79 that you can think of him now with something closer to a cold clinical curiosity than the fear he once produced simply by entering a room. You read some years back in a newspaper account of his eventual death that he went to his grave still convinced he had been wronged, still nursing the particular bitterness of a clever, ambitious man who built an entire architecture of control around a helpless child and then watched that child, the moment she was legally permitted to, dismantle it in the space of a single morning without ever once raising her voice to do it. You do not feel sorry for him. You've tried, once or twice, out of some vague sense that a very old woman ought to have made her peace with every ghost in her story by now, and you find you simply cannot manage it. Some men build cages so carefully, so patiently, so entirely convinced of their own good intentions that they never once notice they've built them. And you think there is a particular kind of justice, cold but real, in watching a cage like that finally fail the one purpose it was ever built for, and you think, always last of her, the girl in the white nightgown on the stairs. You followed her whole long reign the way half of England did, through the newspapers and later the illustrated papers with their engravings, and later still the photographs. Watched her marry a serious young German prince who by every account adored her, watched her bear 9 children, watched her vanish for years into a widow's black after his early death, a grief so total the newspapers said she would not be seen in public for the better part of a decade, and you thought of her, reading those accounts by your own kitchen fire, and wondered whether the girl who once demanded an hour entirely alone might have found, in the end, more solitude than even she had bargained for. You think of the diary you were forbidden to read and glimpsed anyway, 4 words and a line drawn beneath them, "I wish I might go out," and you wonder, some evenings, whether she ever did go out, properly, in the sense that mattered. Whether a woman who spent her whole childhood counting stairs under someone else's watchful hand ever entirely learned to walk down a staircase without listening, some small permanent part of her, for a hand that wasn't there. You hope so. You have hoped so for 60 years, in the particular quiet way an old woman hopes for the well-being of someone she once served and never once, in all the years since, had cause to speak to again. Ellen asks you once, the only time you ever tell her the whole story straight through in a single sitting, rather than in your usual careful fragments, whether you ever regretted it, the risk of it. 4 years of a girl's whole young life spent carrying secrets that could have cost you your place, your character, everything a servant girl in your position had to lose. You think about the question longer than she expects you to, turning the thimble over once in your lap while she waits. "No," you tell her finally. "I've regretted plenty of things in a long life, my girl. Words said too sharp, chances not taken. A whole decade I spent too proud to write to a cousin I loved before she died, and it was too late to mend it. But that, no, that I'd do again tomorrow, if some frightened girl needed a folded paper carried, and I was the only one small enough and quiet enough in the whole house to carry it unnoticed." Ellen doesn't fully understand, not yet being 16, and having never yet been asked to carry anything heavier than her own school books. But she will, you think, watching her young face in the lamplight, turned the story over in her own mind for years the way you've turned it over in yours, and perhaps someday, when some ordinary Tuesday hands her an ordinary choice that turns out, only in hindsight, to have been anything but ordinary, she'll remember an old woman's answer, and it will help her choose the way the Baroness's words once helped you. The mending has slipped from your lap some time ago, though you don't remember quite when, and the candle on the side table has burned down further than you'd meant to let it, throwing long soft shadows across the small room that has been, for 6 years now, entirely your own to keep, in a way no room ever quite was in all your years of service. Outside your window, London goes on the way it has always gone on. Carriages, and now, more and more, the strange coughing engines of the new motor cars. Further off than they were when you were young, a city that has grown up and out and over itself twice since you first arrived as a girl of 16 with cracked knuckles and a bundle of clothes. You reach for the small wooden box on the table beside you, the one that once held your mother's few possessions, and has held for 60 years now yours, and you open it, the hinge creaking softly the way it has always creaked, and you take out the thimble, worn smoother now than it was even when you first received it, the engraved letter V nearly polished away by 6 decades of an old woman's fingers, turning it over and over on evenings exactly like this one. You have never told the whole of this story to anyone but Ellen, and even to her only in careful pieces over years, the way a person doles out a difficult inheritance a little at a time, so the weight of it doesn't fall on anyone all at once. You're telling it whole now, for the first time, to whoever is listening tonight, because you find, at the very far end of a long life, that some stories are meant to be carried quietly for a while, and then, eventually, when the carrying has gone on long enough, set down gently into someone else's keeping. The way a folded letter passes from one sleeve to one pocket, in 90 seconds nobody else in the room ever notices. You think of the girl on the stairs one more time, the white nightgown, the loose unbound hair, the steady unshaking voice carrying further than a voice her size had any right to carry. You think of 22 steps, counted every night for 18 years, and of the one morning they were finally, silently, no longer counted by anyone but her. The candle gutters lower. Your eyes are heavy now, the particular heaviness that comes at the end of a very long day, or a very long life, or both at once, and you find you don't much mind which. You are tired enough now. Tired enough. Tired enough. You have carried a letter, and a fire laid before dawn, and a thimble worn smooth by 60 years of an old woman's fingers, and that is more than most lives are given to carry and carry well. That is enough. Let it come then. Let sleep take you the way it once took a girl in an attic room 200 years and more ago, exhausted past the reach of her own frightened thoughts. Let the ache in your hands fade the way an old woman's hands finally stop aching once the mending is set down for the night. Let the sound of carriages below your window soften into something you no longer have to listen to. Let your thoughts slow and soften and finally gently stop. Tomorrow there will be fires to lay in some other house, in some other century, for some other girl not yet born to lay them. Tomorrow there will be letters carried in someone's sleeve, and secrets kept for people who will never fully know what was kept for them, and staircases counted by children who long to walk them without a hand to hold. Tomorrow there will be a girl somewhere waking before dawn to a cold hearth and a bell she didn't ring herself. But that's tomorrow. Right now there is only this, the candle burned down to its last soft inch. the thimble cool and smooth between old fingers, the quiet of a small room that took 60 years to finally, entirely belong to the woman resting in it. The same as every night before it. The same as the night a letter waited 3 weeks in the lining of a workbox. The same as all the quiet nights stretching out behind her now, further back than most memories reach, and all the quiet nights that will stretch out ahead of whoever is listening to this one. Centuries will pass. The palace you've walked through tonight will change beyond all recognition from the damp, half-empty house it was in 1837. The rooms Alice scrubbed on her knees will be repainted, regilded, roped off, photographed by 10,000 strangers who will never once think to wonder whose hands once kept those hearths burning. The stairs will be climbed by visitors in comfortable shoes who count nothing at all as they climb them. The gardens beyond the windows will fill with people who have never heard the word system and would not recognise its shape if they stood inside it themselves. But girls will still wake before dawn somewhere, to duties they didn't choose and rules they didn't write. People will still love imperfectly and control what they cannot bear to lose, and mistake the two for each other more often than any of them would like to admit. Someone will still be handed a secret too heavy to easily carry and choose, quietly, without being thanked for it, to carry it anyway. Some things don't change. The particular ache of standing straight after an hour on your knees at a cold hearth doesn't change. The particular relief of a warm fire finally catching after 10 patient minutes of kindling doesn't change. The weight of a folded letter passed from one careful hand to another, and the 2 words spoken quietly afterward, "Thank you," don't change, whichever century carries them. And the need for rest, at the very end of a very long day, whatever that day contained, whatever it cost, whatever small, dangerous kindness it asked of you and you gave anyway, that never changes either. So let it come. Let sleep take you the way it took a 16-year-old housemaid on 100 ordinary nights in a cold attic room above a palace nobody warm enough was watching. Let it take you the way it took an old woman in 1899, a thimble held loosely in one softened hand, a whole difficult, extraordinary year finally gently set down. Let the world outside your own window fade the way Kensington faded behind Alice, Aldous' closing eyes, on her last quiet night in that small back room. The carriages and the far-off engines and the whole vast changing city settling into something she no longer had to hold in her mind at all. Let your own thoughts slow and soften and finally stop. You've earned this rest, whatever your own day carried. Take it. And dream, if you dream at all tonight, of a small folded paper riding safe inside a sleeve, of 22 counted steps finally, silently, uncounted, of a girl in a white nightgown walking alone into the rest of her life, chin lifted, spine straight, no hand required at all. Good night.